Good morning. First time standing at the front. So 1 Corinthians. It's an interesting book to look at. Paul is writing to a church in Corinth, struggling to find what it is about themselves that sets them apart. How is it that this church is to be that is going to be different from everything else that's out there? What is it about the church that makes it church? And so as I look back on the readings that you've had this week, sort of just skipping over, I thought I'd do a quick overview and see the sort of touch points that Paul is writing about. So he starts in chapter 5. He talks about sex. Always good to get people's attention by talking about sex right at the start. Living by example, greed, idolatry, drunkenness. He talks about lawsuits and disagreements in chapter 6. He talks in chapter 7 about marriage and self-control. In chapter 8, he talks about food and idols, the things he eats and drinks, what sets the church apart in terms of how it acts. In chapter 9, one that Andy will love, he talks about supporting the workers, about making sure that those who are in authority in the church are supported and free to do their witness. And in chapter 10, he talks about justice, a reminder that there is a God of justice. Before chapter 11, where he talks about authority and order, about divisions in the church, about communion, about how you're to act in a way that is authentic. And so as I came to kind of approaching today's topic, today's sermon, I wanted to title it as Walking the Walk. What does it mean to be an authentic church? Because after all, that's really what 1 Corinthians is about. And the biggest problem that I find with authenticity in the church today is about sin. When I was a child, there was a quote on DC Talk album saying the biggest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out of the door, and let him down by their lifestyle. Sin. And so I thought I'd start by making you all church leaders. So I've placed on the end of your rows and dotted around, there's an envelope. If you open the envelopes or you search around you, you'll find there's a couple of slips of paper. In those, there's a couple of case studies. Please be aware that all characters contained within these case studies are purely fictitious and are made up. Some of the names were stolen from Guess Who, just to give you an idea of how simple I've taken it. I want you to have a look at those case studies. Imagine that you're a church leader. Imagine that these are the people in your congregation. And I want you to have a think, chat amongst yourselves. Yes, I know, talk in church, it's terrible. See what you would say to them. How would you advise them? How would you counsel them? Just have a think. I'll give you a couple of minutes. I would say I'd play some lift music, but I don't have any. So off you go. How'd you get on? Yeah? Did you find some of them easier than others to read? Who had Herman? Give us a wave if you had Herman. I kind of felt sorry for Herman. He was lovely. And who had the chap that had an affair? Was that one a little bit harder to think about? You see, I always had a problem. When I was a kid, I kind of got sin as a list of things that you did wrong. That's what I always thought sin was. I always thought that sin was like the things that I'd done wrong in a day. That was my simplistic view of it. So as I kind of came to the end of the day and being a nice Christian young boy, I'd sit down and I'd try and say sorry for all the sins that I'd done that day. And so I'd sit there and I'd say, you know, I'm really sorry, God. I didn't eat my Brussels sprouts at dinner time today. I was sat there for 3 hours while Mum tore her hair out. And, you know, I'm sorry, I was bad about doing that. I'm sorry I punched my brother and I really didn't like having to stare at the wall for the next 10 minutes as a punishment for that. Or, you know, I'm sorry that I swore and I'm sorry that I let my friends down. And then by the end of it, I'd sort of come to a point where I was sitting there going, I've forgotten everything else. I'm sure I've screwed up in other ways as well. Like, I don't know what it is. What have I missed? What have I forgotten? And so I started praying this little prayer at the end of it that said, and God, I'm sorry for anything else that I've missed. You know what it is, I don't, but please forgive me for it anyway. And I think, as we look at sin, we really struggle to get a handle on some sins are easier than others. Some sins are really obvious. Some sins aren't so obvious. And the problem is that I think my understanding of sin was wrong. Sin isn't a list of the naughty list of things that you've done. If you think of, I don't know if you were ever in school at the age where I was, we used to have these bars in the gyms in our primary school that were wheeled out and sort of raised up like this. And it was sort of a big wooden beam. And you had to try and climb over that beam as a kid. And being sort of quite a short kid, some kids couldn't get over it easily and some really could. But I think sin is, if that's God's standard, if you imagine that bar is God's standard, that is the perfect standard that God sets. That is who he is. Anything short of that standard is sin. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit short or a long way short. That falling short is what sin is. It's not a list of the rights and wrongs. It's a difference in standards between the way that we live and the standard that God sets. And so when you approach it like this, when Paul is writing to a church, trying to help it to be an authentic church, it's about understanding those differences in standards and how we respond to them. The second thing that I wanted to talk about with sin is that it's about intention in our hearts. If we are striving as a church to be authentic, if I'm striving as a Christian to be authentic, to live in the best way that I can live, there are things that get in the way of me being able to live like that. There are strongholds in my life. There are things that crop up time and time and time again. Whether it's a feeling that I am just not good enough, whether it's a behavior that I keep doing, whether it's something that is not right in my life that I want to break down, there is a stronghold that we keep returning to. I want to share a little bit of an illustration that I have with this. When I was a teenager, my parents had a garden path that ran from the front of their house down to their gateway at their drive. And they wanted to break it up. They wanted to put in a new driveway. And so Dad asked me one day, could you help me break up this path? And so what I did was I went and I found the biggest sledgehammer in the garden shed. And I took it and I smashed that sledgehammer down on the end of the path. And nothing happened. There was no difference. There was no sign at all. So I brought it back and I smashed it down again. And there was no difference. And I kept doing it time after time after time until eventually a tiny crack appeared. And a lump of the path came away in my hand. And when you look at breaking down strongholds in your life, when you're trying to defeat those areas of sin that are just habitual, that you keep going back to, what you're doing is bringing that sledgehammer down time after time. And eventually, through the help of Christ, a crack will appear and a chunk of that path will come away. And so what you might be thinking right now is, I really want to be a better Christian. I really want to live an authentic lifestyle, but I just can't see that change. Just keep bringing that sledgehammer down. Eventually a crack will appear, the chunk will come away, and you will find that there's progress. I want to move on and talk about, why does it matter? Why does sin matter? Well, in chapter 10, Paul talks about justice, that there needs to be justice, that there is a God who is a just God, who sets that standard. There needs to be a reckoning. Me and Sarah, in our quiet times recently, we've been reading through Psalms. And throughout Psalms, there is a huge cry from humanity about justice. When we look at the world around us, it is so obvious that there is injustice. Every world faith recognizes a need for there to be justice, a reckoning, that there is injustice in the world and that there needs to be a balancing of the books. And we can't get away from that. That there is a God out there who needs to bring justice and balance, that there will be a reckoning behind it. The world out there looks for authenticity. It looks for reality. It looks for a church that is trying to be different. And God will judge at the end of the day. Me earning my way in. Christianity is not about that. It's not about us struggling and jumping to try and get over that bar that's always too high. It's about the person of Christ coming down and lifting us up on his shoulders to get over that bar. You want to talk about authentic Christian living? My friends, you're free. You're loved. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm sorry. You can try as hard as you like. It's not about your effort. It's not about how hard you swing that sledgehammer. In the 9 o'clock service, I was talking about that illustration, and we got interrupted by someone saying, "What you need is a jackhammer." Well, Jesus is your jackhammer. He's the person that causes those cracks to come. He's the one that opens those holes and lifts it out. It is not in your strength. It is in Christ's. And if you want to talk about authentic Christian living, express that joy, that freedom that you have, because that is what absolutely... The concept that you are free, that you are loved, that it is not in your strength. It is not about being good enough. It is about heaven coming down, not us reaching up. And don't keep it under your hat. This world needs authentic Christian living. It needs to know that we are broken people, that we aren't perfect, that when I come to church in the morning, I mess things up constantly through the week. But I am forgiven. I am free. I am loved. And there is nothing that anyone can do to separate us from the love of God. Amen.